So this video has been somewhat of a long time coming because I did plant the seed earlier in various streams and in comment sections under my videos. But part of the reason I've been hesitant to talk about this is because it's a pretty deep subject matter to cover. But quite a few of my viewers seem to be knowledgeable enough to understand some of these matters, so I'll do my best to convey all my thoughts and feelings in a very concise manner. So Veggietales. Veggietales has long been celebrated as innocent Christian entertainment for kids, right? The show was originally produced by Big Idea Productions, which had a distribution deal with Baker Bookhouse, and later with Lyric Studios and Warner Home Video. But it became closely associated with Focus on the Family for marketing and distribution purposes, especially for home video sales and Christian retail. Focus on the Family promoted it heavily as part of their family-friendly Christian media offerings, though they did not produce it in-house initially. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Focus on the Family was founded and led by one Dr. James Dobson, who passed away sometime last month. Dobson was a conservative Christian, and theologically he was a literalist, a pastoral teacher who prioritized moral instruction, therapeutic emotional comfort, and family values. Now, if you're a Christian right now, you might be asking, okay, what's the problem with all that? Well, the problem is, most of this was psychological help dressed in Christianity, and therefore doctrinal or symbolic complexity took a backseat to secular ideals. And that would be the core of my argument as to why Veggietales would be Proto-Woke media. The goal of this kind of media is not to cultivate a theological sophistication, but rather to shape hearts and habits so that they are more in line with evangelical moral teachings. It's a psychology first, bolt-on Christianity second approach. And Veggietales fits neatly within this worldview. Another thing worth noting is that Dobson's influence extended beyond pedagogy. He was also a prominent Christian Zionist, advocating for Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy and framing support for the modern state as both moral and theological. Now, while that dimension is probably less evident in Veggietales itself, it still situates the show within a broader cultural and political framework in which faith, morality, and media are inseparable from the larger goals of evangelical activism. Now, this strategy is profoundly instructive, though not in the way most viewers realize. In this mode of storytelling, psychology precedes theology, and moral reassurance precedes covenantal fidelity. What that means is that the gospel is applied superficially. A decorative layer bolted onto the story, rather than becoming its animating center. In fact, let's take the very first episode of Veggietales. Where is God when I'm scared? And there, Junior Asparagus experiences fear while watching a scary movie. Now, what's the resolution in this episode? The resolution is psychological. God is bigger than the boogeyman. Also note, the boogeyman is never truly revealed to be dangerous. He's merely misunderstood.
Oh, by the way, there's someone else who wants to meet you.
It's friggin' celery!
Well, actually, my name is Phil Winkelstein, and I'm an actor from Toledo.
And that subtly teaches children that threats can be reasoned with or negotiated with, reinforcing a mindset in which fear is just a psychological problem you can manage, rather than a spiritual reality to be confronted through faith and obedience. This is a tendency that carries over into broader narratives such as how threats that in reality might be existential or external are framed not as moral or political challenges, but as problems to be negotiated with or reasoned with or psychologically managed. Fear is then domesticated, transformed into an internal obstacle rather than an objective reality, reinforcing a mindset in which comfort, persuasion, and what modern feminists like to call emotional intelligence are elevated above moral discernment and courage. Now think of the biblical story of Daniel, who survived being thrown into a den of lions, a story that Veggietales also adapted with its characters. And if we adapt it to a psychological narrative, what we're left with here is Daniel as a model of courage under pressure, but not as a prophet confronting imperial oppression. To understand that, you would have to look at biblical history in general. And historically, Daniel operates within the context of Babylonian exile, a time when the Jewish people were subjected to foreign rule. And therefore, every act of faithfulness, every refusal to compromise was a microcosm of Israel's corporate struggle to remain covenantal. Daniel's preservation is not merely psychological encouragement in this case, it is a theological statement that God remains sovereign over empires, and that fidelity to God's covenant has tangible consequences, and that God will vindicate his faithful servants in history. So we have a smaller arc of Daniel's personal trial which affirms and participates in the larger arc of God's redemptive plan, the exile, the preservation of the faithful remnant. Every detail from his enemies' schemes to the king's authority to the lions themselves serves to highlight the contrast between earthly power and divine authority. The story is a window into the entire exilic and post-exilic witness of Scripture, faithful obedience under threat, divine intervention, and the eventual vindication of God's people. So if you view it this way, Daniel's story is not a generic be brave lesson. It is a covenantal, historically grounded and chiastically structured narrative that points to God's overarching plan for his people. This versus a story where God just exists and he's a comforting presence and he's not a sovereign redeemer of covenant history. No, his theological substance is minimal and the lesson is just personal and emotional. Emphasis on personal and emotional, and we see how that ties into the whole dispensationalists or boomer eschatological point of view that has relegated faith in God to something that you do in private, or it shouldn't have any impact in how you interact with the world, that kind of thing. And it aligns with a broader interpretive habit cultivated in many evangelical children. Scripture is often taught as a collection of moral fables. Joseph is honest, David is brave, Jonah learns obedience, etc., etc. Meanwhile, chiastic structures, typology, and the complex covenantal architecture of the text is rarely emphasized in the Bible. Children are then habituated to read the Bible for its lessons rather than for its theological depth. And Veggietales exploits this pedagogical gap, placing biblical narratives into a cartoonish frame that reinforces psychological moralism and emotional satisfaction over covenantal truth. And the cartoonish aesthetic is not incidental to any of this. You see, by transforming Daniel, Jonah, and other biblical figures into vegetables with slapstick voices and silly songs, the show signals that these stories are entertainment first and theological instruction second. The moral lesson is appended like an accessory, a comforting postscript to the spectacle, and therefore viewers from a young age will learn to expect Scripture, and by extension religion, to function just as amusement with moral decoration. Again, the result is psychology with bolt-on Christianity. Now, the consequences extend beyond the show itself. Children accustomed to this form of narrative are predisposed to receive later media through a therapeutic lens. Stories will be evaluated primarily for their emotional and moral resonance, but not for their fidelity to truth or structural integrity. And thus, Scripture ceases to be a living encounter and becomes a backdrop for effective reassurance. Now, this all anticipates a proto-woke cultural logic, in which moral affirmation and emotional efficacy are paramount and doctrinal depth is marginal. And here's the thing, what this means is that if psychology becomes preeminent over Christ, it does not merely supplement your faith, it eventually supplants it. And that's why figures such as Oprah Winfrey, for example, who in many ways serves as the Sigmund Freud of our time, can also claim a Christian identity. For her, Christianity is secondary. It's just an accessory to the primary authority of therapy, personal insight, or scientific rationality. And it was during the lockdowns the ramifications of all these tendencies became painfully clear. Your religious practices were subordinated to the dictates of psychological or technological authority, and Christians were not exempt from this. We were all told to trust the science, and what happened? Most of us complied without question. Yes, Christians included. We treated government mandates and public health guidance as ultimate arbiters rather than measuring them against Christian foundations. And it really goes to show how faith has become measured by comfort, by convenience, and by emotional validation, rather than in obedience to the living God. The very authority of Christ was deferred to the authority of the experts, reinforcing the primacy of psychology and instrumental reasoning over theological fidelity. And all of this is to say, Veggietales exemplified the same dynamic by flattening the narrative of Scripture into entertainment with a moral postscript. The show trained its viewers to place the authority of effect and reassurance above the sovereignty of Christ. The Bible therefore becomes a backdrop for emotional satisfaction rather than a medium through which God directly addresses his people, and therefore theology is reduced to philosophy or psychology, and covenant with God is reduced to sentiment. This orientation has had profound cultural consequences. It all helps explain the contrast between our forefathers and ourselves. Our forefathers, they recognized their place in history, or they seemed to anyway. They understood their obligations to God and to their neighbors, to the extent that they were willing to sacrifice themselves for freedoms rooted in truth. In contrast, look at us today. We've been trained to turn inward, to obsess over our own personal fulfillment and self-consolation, often mistaking comfort for virtue. We navel-gaze, we self-congratulate, we outsource the shaping of our conscience to science, to therapy, or to popular culture, all the while waiting passively for some promised apocalypse or a rapture to resolve our anxiety. And anyway, that's why Veggietales is proto-woke. This probably wasn't the answer you were expecting, but if you want something more overt, let me leave you with this. Consider the episode The Gourds Must Be Crazy. It was released back in 1997. I was 10 years old at the time. And anyway, you have the character Junior Asparagus, who encounters two very eccentric gourds, characters we are repeatedly told by the other characters are just weirdos. And what's the moral lesson of that episode? Well, Junior Asparagus is taught to accept them, to tolerate them, to find them amusing and safe. A lesson framed not in covenantal terms, not in obedience to God, but in social comfort and emotional adjustment. Now tell me, what do you think this means in the mind of a child when he is told that the proper response when encountering a bunch of flamboyant weirdos is approval and amusement? How does that shape the way we understand virtue, authority, and truth? I leave these questions with you because they're not merely about a cartoon. They are the way entire generations were taught to orient their hearts and minds when psychology and comfort are elevated above Christ and covenant.